In the spring of 1241, Europe did not yet understand what was coming. Rumors had traveled faster than armies. Cities burned beyond the horizon. Kingdoms erased between seasons. Riders appearing at dawn and vanishing before nightfall. Entire populations scattered like ash before a desert wind. To many in Central Europe, these stories felt distant, distortions from the far edges of Christendom. But they were not myths. They were reports of a military machine forged on the steppe and perfected through decades of relentless conquest. The army belonged to the expanding empire created by Genghis Khan. By 1241, Genghis had been dead for nearly 14 years. Yet his empire had not slowed. It had grown. Under his successors, the Mongol war machine had moved westward with deliberate purpose. The conquest of the Rus principalities had been systematic. Cities like Kiev had fallen with terrifying speed. Resistance was punished, submission accepted, but always on Mongol terms. Europe had little time to understand the scale of what had already happened. At the center of this westward expansion stood a commander of calculated restraint and cold discipline, Subutai. Subutai was not a prince. He was not a noble by birth. He was the son of a blacksmith, yet by the 1240s, he had become the architect of the Mongols' most sophisticated campaigns. His strength was not brute force. It was coordination, planning, the orchestration of movements across thousands of kilometers. The invasion of Europe was not a reckless raid. It was a multi-front operation. One Mongol force drove through the Carpathians into Hungary. Another moved north toward Poland. Their objective was clear: prevent European kingdoms from uniting, strike them separately, destroy their armies before they could combine. It was strategy built on isolation. In Poland, political fragmentation made that task easier. The Polish realm in 1241 was divided among rival Piast dukes. Authority was regional, coordination uncertain. Local rulers answered first to their own territories before any broader national structure. There was no single king commanding a unified army, but there was one figure determined to resist. Henry II the Pious, Duke of Silesia, understood the threat with unusual clarity. He had seen the devastation in neighboring lands. He recognized that this was not another border raid by nomadic tribes. This was organized conquest. Henry began gathering forces. He called upon Silesian knights, Polish levies, mercenaries from Moravia. He appealed to the military orders. A small contingent of the Knights Templar responded, along with other Western volunteers drawn by religious obligation and the defense of Christendom. But assembling an army is not the same as forging unity. The European commanders who answered Henry's call did not share a common doctrine. Their experience lay in feudal warfare, sieges, regional disputes, heavy cavalry engagements decided by direct impact. They were accustomed to facing opponents who stood and fought. The Mongols did not fight that way. Through the winter of 1240 into early 1241, Mongol detachments moved methodically across Poland. Cities like Sandomierz and Krakow were attacked, looted, and abandoned. The Mongols did not remain to occupy every settlement. They struck and withdrew, creating confusion about their numbers and intentions. To European observers, it seemed as though Mongol forces were everywhere at once. In reality, their numbers were far smaller than imagined. The northern Mongol column advancing into Poland likely numbered around 20,000 men, organized into disciplined tumans and subunits. Each warrior carried multiple horses. Each unit operated with strict communication signals. They could disperse, scout, regroup, and strike with remarkable speed. But to the European imagination, the invaders appeared limitless. Reports spoke of hundreds of thousands. Fear multiplied faster than facts. Henry II faced immense pressure. Every delay allowed Mongol detachments to burn more towns. Refugees flooded westward. Panic eroded confidence. And crucially, the Hungarian kingdom, Europe's other major defensive front, was preparing for its own confrontation. If Poland collapsed too quickly, Hungary would stand alone. Henry chose confrontation. He concentrated his forces near the town of Liegnitz, modern-day Legnica, in southwestern Poland. The region offered open terrain suitable for cavalry engagement. It was not mountainous. It was not heavily forested. It was a place where European knights could maneuver. Henry likely hoped for reinforcements from Bohemia. King Wenceslaus had promised aid and was advancing northward. But coordination in medieval Europe was slow. Messages took time. Roads were uncertain. Weather unpredictable. The Mongols understood this. Subuti's broader strategy relied on preventing the unification of Christian armies. The northern Mongol detachment under commanders such as Baidar and Khadan had one objective: neutralize Polish forces before they could join Bohemian reinforcements or link with Hungary. Speed was essential. As March turned into April, Mongol scouts shadowed Henry's assembling army. They mapped terrain. They monitored supply routes. They probed forward positions. To the Europeans, the Mongols seemed evasive. To the Mongols, this was preparation. Psychologically, the pressure on Henry's coalition grew daily. His army was diverse. Silesian nobles, Polish levies, German knights, Moravian infantry, small detachments of Templars. Each contingent brought its own expectations and traditions. Feudal armies were built on honor and personal valor. Knights sought decisive combat. Withdrawal could be mistaken for cowardice. Impetuous charges were common. The Mongols exploited that mindset. They had done so against Russian princes, against Khwarezmian armies, against Central Asian warlords. They understood that European heavy cavalry, once committed, was difficult to control. Henry faced a dilemma: wait for Bohemian reinforcements and risk Mongol raids continuing unchecked, or engage quickly to halt the devastation and demonstrate strength. He chose engagement. It was a decision shaped by urgency, incomplete intelligence, and the weight of expectation. By early April 1241, Henry's army advanced toward the Mongol position near Liegnitz. He likely believed he faced a forward raiding force, not the core of a coordinated strategic maneuver designed to pin and destroy him. The Mongols encouraged that belief. They did not fortify. They did not entrench. They maneuvered lightly, remaining mobile across open ground. Smoke from burned settlements hung faintly in the distance, a reminder of what awaited defeat. On April 9, 1241, the two forces approached contact. Henry's army may have numbered between 25,000 and 40,000 men, far fewer than later chroniclers claimed, but still significantly larger than the Mongol force he faced. Medieval exaggerations inflated numbers into the hundreds of thousands, but logistical realities make such figures impossible. Even at more realistic estimates, the Europeans outnumbered the Mongols, but numbers were not the decisive factor. Discipline was, coordination was, and understanding of the battlefield was. The Mongols had already selected ground favorable to their tactics, open enough for maneuver, yet broad enough to stretch European formations thin. They had prepared signaling systems. Reserve units were positioned behind screens of horse archers. Drums and flags would transmit commands across the field. For the Europeans, battle meant collision. For the Mongols, battle meant orchestration. As dawn rose over the plains near Liegnitz, two fundamentally different military cultures prepared to test each other. One built on armored shock and individual valor. The other built on mobility, deception, and relentless discipline. Henry II rode at the center of his coalition, bearing both political authority and personal responsibility. Around him stood nobles who believed in direct confrontation. Many likely expected the Mongols to break under the weight of heavy cavalry. Few yet understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was not the bow, it was patience. And somewhere beyond the visible lines, Mongol commanders were already calculating how to fracture this coalition, how to draw it apart, how to turn its confidence into vulnerability. The plains of Liegnitz would not host a prolonged siege. They would host a lesson, one Europe would not soon forget. Morning on April 9, 1241, broke cold and uncertain over the plains near Liegnitz. A thin mist lingered over the open ground, softening the horizon and blurring distances. For the European host gathered under Henry II the Pious, the day carried the weight of both duty and fear. The army was an assembly of regional powers rather than a single disciplined machine. Silesian knights in heavy mail, Polish levies armed with spears and axes, Moravian infantry, German volunteers, and contingent from the Knights Templar. Their banners snapped in the wind, bright with heraldic colors, each symbol representing a lord, a lineage, a localized chain of loyalty. What united them was not uniform training or shared command doctrine, but the understanding that the invaders advancing from the east threatened not merely territory, but the structure of their world. Across the field, the Mongol army presented a very different image. Their lines were less rigid, less ornamental. They did not form a dense wall of steel. Instead, mounted figures shifted continuously, light cavalry archers riding in loose formations, maintaining distance. Each warrior controlled multiple horses, allowing rapid rotation and sustained mobility. Their armor was practical rather than ornate. Lamellar plates, leather, fur-lined garments suited for endurance. Signals moved silently across their ranks through banners and horns. Orders passed without visible confusion. The force facing Henry likely numbered around 20,000 men, but its apparent size fluctuated as units moved in and out of sight. To European observers accustomed to static battle lines, this fluidity created the illusion of unpredictability. Henry arranged his army in traditional medieval fashion, divided into several divisions or battles. At the front stood lighter troops and auxiliary forces, with the heavier cavalry held ready to exploit opportunity. The European method of war depended on shock. Armored knights would advance in disciplined ranks, lances lowered, seeking to break the enemy through concentrated impact. Once a line fractured, pursuit would follow and cohesion would dissolve. This doctrine had proven effective in regional conflicts across Central Europe. It assumed that the enemy would stand and receive the charge. The Mongols did not intend to oblige. Initial contact began with skirmishing. Mongol horse archers advanced within range, loosing volleys of arrows before wheeling away. Their composite bows, compact yet powerful, could penetrate armor at close distance and harass from afar. They did not linger. They provoked. European infantry and cavalry responded with forward movement, attempting to close distance, but the Mongols retreated deliberately, maintaining just enough separation to avoid decisive engagement. This pattern was not spontaneous. It was methodical erosion. For European knights, restraint under provocation was difficult. Honor culture and battlefield expectation encouraged action. Arrows striking shields and armor created not only physical threat, but psychological agitation. Each retreat by the Mongols resembled weakness. It suggested disorder. Some European commanders interpreted this as an opportunity to press advantage quickly before the enemy regrouped. Henry faced a challenge of coordination among semi-independent contingents. Medieval command structures lacked centralized communication systems. Once units advanced, controlling them became increasingly difficult. Signals were visual and auditory, easily obscured by dust, distance, or confusion. When the 1st European Division pushed forward aggressively, attempting to engage retreating Mongol cavalry, the cohesion of the broader formation began to stretch. The Mongols had anticipated this reaction. Feigned retreat was a practiced maneuver, refined across decades of warfare under commanders like Subutai, whose strategic principles guided operations even when he was not physically present. The concept was simple but required discipline. Simulate flight convincingly enough to lure the enemy into pursuit, then exploit overextension. The maneuver demanded that every rider resist the instinct to turn prematurely. Timing was critical. As the European vanguard accelerated, their lines elongated. Heavy cavalry, built for shock rather than endurance, committed to forward momentum. The terrain, though open, was not perfectly even. Small undulations disrupted tight formations. Dust clouds rose beneath hooves, reducing visibility. Units that began the advance in relative alignment gradually separated. Communication between Henry and forward commanders became strained. At this stage, the Mongols intensified missile fire. Arrows struck horses as often as riders. A fallen mount could shatter formation, creating gaps and disorder. European knights, encased in mail and surcoats, were protected but not invulnerable. Their horses, less armored, suffered heavily. The psychological effect of watching mounts collapse beneath comrades added to the sense of instability. Some European divisions pressed deeper, convinced the enemy was close to breaking. Others hesitated, uncertain whether to reinforce the pursuit or maintain defensive posture. The cohesion of Henry's coalition began to fracture along lines of command and temperament. What had been a unified front slowly transformed into staggered waves of engagement. At a calculated moment, Mongol units executed a coordinated turn. Horse archers who had been retreating pivoted and began firing from new angles. Additional Mongol detachments, previously obscured, emerged from flanking positions. The Europeans who had advanced furthest suddenly found themselves isolated, exposed to crossfire. Momentum shifted from pursuit to survival. Compounding the disorientation was the deployment of smoke tactics reported in several chronicles. Mongol forces are believed to have used smoke, possibly from burning grass or controlled fires, to obscure vision and sow confusion. In a medieval battlefield lacking precise communication, limited visibility magnified uncertainty. Knights could not easily distinguish between retreating allies and advancing enemies. Sound replaced sight as primary perception. Hoes, shouted commands, the impact of arrows. Henry attempted to stabilize the line by committing additional forces, but reinforcing a forward element already stretched thin required movement across terrain, now cluttered with wounded men and animals. Each reinforcement risked compounding congestion. Meanwhile, Mongol reserves remained coordinated. Units rotated seamlessly, fresh riders replacing those who had expended arrows or exhausted mounts. The Mongol command structure relied on decimal organization, groups of tens, hundreds, thousands, each under designated officers. Orders cascaded efficiently. European forces, by contrast, operated through feudal hierarchy. Loyalty was personal, not structural. When a local commander fell or withdrew, his contingent might follow independently of the broader strategy. As the battle progressed, Mongol cavalry intensified pressure on the flanks. European heavy cavalry, effective in direct frontal assault, struggled to respond to attacks from multiple directions. Turning a mounted formation under fire required space and discipline. Arrows continued to rain, targeting horses, unshielded joints, exposed faces. At some point during the engagement, a critical misinterpretation appears to have occurred within the European ranks. A rumor or signal, possibly mistaken, suggested that Henry had been killed or that retreat was ordered. Medieval chronicles differ on the precise sequence, but battlefield communication breakdown was evident. In an army lacking standardized command, uncertainty about leadership could rapidly degrade morale. The Mongols exploited this instability immediately. A coordinated counterattack pressed against fragmented European units. What had begun as an aggressive charge now became piecemeal resistance. Knights fought individually or in small clusters rather than as cohesive lines. Infantry units, unsupported, were particularly vulnerable to encirclement by mounted archers. Henry himself remained active within the field, attempting to rally forces. His presence, symbolically powerful, could not reverse structural fragmentation. The Mongols avoided direct prolonged melee with concentrated heavy cavalry. Instead, they isolated pockets, wore them down, and struck where resistance weakened. The small contingent of the Knights Templar fought with characteristic discipline, but their numbers were insufficient to alter overall dynamics. Even elite units could not compensate for systemic disorganization. Against a mobile enemy controlling tempo and distance, localized bravery could not restore cohesion. By midday, the battlefield near Liegnitz had transformed. Dust hung thick. The ground was marked by fallen horses and broken lances. European formations were no longer intact divisions but scattered remnants. The Mongol army, though still fluid, maintained operational unity. Their feigned retreat had drawn the coalition into extension. Their counterstroke now pressed advantage. The psychological shift was decisive. What European commanders had initially interpreted as Mongol weakness revealed itself as deliberate design. Realization spread too late. Units attempting to withdraw found avenues blocked by Mongol cavalry sweeping behind them. Others fought surrounded, their armor heavy, mobility limited. Henry faced narrowing options. To disengage required coordinated retreat under continuous missile fire. To continue fighting risked encirclement. Medieval armies, once cohesion dissolved, rarely reassembled mid-battle. The outcome now depended less on numerical strength than on which side retained command integrity. The Mongols had not rushed. They had allowed pressure to build gradually. Provocation, pursuit, extension, isolation. Each phase flowed into the next without visible hesitation. The European coalition, though larger in raw numbers, had entered the battle expecting decisive impact. Instead, it found itself fighting an enemy that refused the terms of engagement. The plains near Liegnitz had become a testing ground not only of armies, but of military systems. One structured around decentralized valor and shock, the other around coordination, deception, and calculated patience. As the Mongol encirclement tightened, the battle moved toward its irreversible phase. By mid-afternoon, the outcome at Liegnitz was no longer in question, though few surviving European commanders could fully grasp how quickly their hopes had unraveled. The initial pride of the coalition, assembled under Henry II the Pious, had dissolved into a struggle for survival. The Mongols maintained their disciplined orchestration, pressing pressure from multiple directions while never fully committing to a frontal clash that might risk their cohesion. Each feigned retreat, each encircling sweep, had drawn European forces into positions where retreat became perilous. Dust, smoke, and the constant rattle of arrows compounded confusion. Knights who had anticipated decisive impact now found themselves disoriented, their flanks exposed, and their command chains fractured. They faced a foe whose strength lay not in individual heroics, but in the relentless application of tactical principles, each maneuver calculated to exploit human psychology, terrain, and the limitations of medieval organization. Henry II's personal command became increasingly symbolic rather than functional. He rode through shattered formations, attempting to rally isolated contingents, shouting orders that were increasingly ignored or misunderstood. The Mongols had recognized that medieval European armies were prone to collapse once the perception of leadership weakness took hold. They exploited this vulnerability with precision. Even the presence of elite knights or disciplined Templar units could not restore coherence when the bulk of the army had been drawn into overextension and separation. European cavalry, weighed by armor and relying on momentum, could not execute rapid adjustments in response to mobile archers striking from unexpected angles. Infantry units, poorly coordinated and now surrounded, became targets for encirclement. The Mongols employed mobility and concentrated missile fire to isolate and neutralize sections sequentially rather than risking a general melee, a strategy perfected over decades across the steppes and the forests of Eastern Europe. The psychological strain on the defenders intensified as the battlefield became a maze of fallen comrades and mounting casualties. Medieval soldiers were trained to expect decisive engagements, often with the implicit assumption that lines will hold long enough for knights to exploit a breakthrough. At Liegnitz, however, the Mongols denied such opportunity. Their forces were not attempting to break immediately. They were controlling the tempo. Every advance by a European detachment was calculated to increase vulnerability elsewhere. Retreating units were met with renewed harassment. Commands given were either impossible to execute fully under pressure or misinterpreted amid chaos. The Mongols' ability to maintain operational control over a fluid battlefield demonstrated a profound difference between European and steppe military doctrines. Whereas European warfare prized shock, concentration, and honor, Mongol strategy relied on sustained disruption, mobility, and psychological manipulation. Soldiers began to realize, often too late, that discipline and valor alone could not counter an adversary orchestrating the entire field. As the battle progressed into the afternoon, the Mongols intensified their encirclement. Units that had been in continuous contact with enemy troops began to swing inward, tightening the perimeter around pockets of resisting knights and infantry. Those who had advanced furthest during earlier pursuits now found themselves trapped. Horses exhausted from pursuit collapsed under sustained arrow volleys, rendering armored riders immobile and vulnerable. Infantry, unable to maneuver effectively, were systematically routed. Mongol commanders demonstrated not only tactical awareness, but operational patience. They waited for the right moment to strike decisively, avoiding unnecessary losses. In this way, the smaller Mongol force amplified its effectiveness against an army whose numerical advantage had become irrelevant in the face of superior coordination and battlefield control. Reports from contemporary chronicles indicate that at some point during the collapse, European forces attempted a countercharge aimed at regrouping and breaking through encirclement. This effort, while courageous, was fragmented. Without coherent timing or integrated support, it failed to achieve meaningful impact. Mongol units, Utilizing both mobility and layered reserves, absorbed the counterattack and redirected attention to other points of vulnerability. The interplay between European overcommitment and Mongol patience exemplified the broader strategic lesson of Liegnitz. Numbers alone cannot prevail against an adversary who understands both the mechanics of the battlefield and the psychology of its opponents. Every advance by the Europeans had been anticipated, every overextension exploited, and as resistance faltered, the Mongols executed controlled sweeps, isolating leaders, breaking morale, and amplifying panic. Henry II, despite his efforts to hold cohesion, was eventually struck down amid the chaos. His death had immediate and profound consequences. Medieval armies were highly dependent on visible leadership. A fallen commander often triggered routes among forces that already faced mounting fear and disorganization. With Henry gone, local lords and knights attempted to maintain order, but the structural weaknesses in command and communication became catastrophic. Units that had advanced in pursuit now withdrew without coordination, some fleeing across open ground directly into areas prepared by Mongol reserves. The psychological shock of witnessing both the loss of leadership and the relentless efficiency of the enemy accelerated collapse. Those few European contingents that retained cohesion could not compensate for the broader disintegration of the army. The Mongols methodically swept through the remaining forces, leaving only scattered survivors and a field dominated by the aftermath of annihilation. Casualties were enormous. Contemporary estimates are often exaggerated, yet the pattern is clear. The European coalition was shattered, its infantry decimated, its cavalry neutralized, and its leadership eliminated. Mongol losses, by contrast, were minimal. Their tactical approach had allowed them to impose destruction while maintaining operational integrity. The victory at Liegnitz was not merely the result of physical prowess, but a strategic vision, psychological control, and disciplined execution. The Mongols' ability to manipulate engagement distance, force overextension, and exploit fractured command chains demonstrates why relatively small numbers could overwhelm much larger formations in the medieval context. Liegnitz stands as a clear example of asymmetric effectiveness in military history, where understanding the psychology of opponents and mastering maneuver outweighed mere size.